Welcome back to MonsterTamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, for our cutscenes and in-game events feature, we worked on updating the logic in our world scene to check for overlaps between our player and our event zone game objects. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code to this point, as well as a complete source code for this video. There will also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Now that we have our logic in place in our world scene, for knowing when our player is overlapping with one of our event zone game objects, and we know which event zone we're currently interacting with, now we need to figure out what we want to do when that happens. So now we need to define what our event is for our game. So for our event, in the terms of like a cutscene, when our player interacts with one of our event zones, we might want to do things like have an NPC show up, move up to our player, talk to them, leave the scene. Our NPC could do other actions like give our player an item, give them a monster, or even trigger a battle. And all of these are different types of actions we're going to want to do during our event. So for our event data structure we define, we want to be able to provide an array of these actions that we need to react to in our code in Phaser. So for our structure, we'll have these various events and we'll have the action they can do. And then we need to provide our metadata of that's associated with that action. As an example, when we add an NPC to our scene, we'll need to know what position to add them in. We'll need to know which frame and animation to use when the NPC moves around. And then when we want to do things for like talk to our player, we'll need to know which NPC is actually talking so we can hook into our NPC class. We'll need to know the messages that they're going to say to the player. And so like when our NPC wants to move, we'll need to know which position our NPC is moving to, and we'll need to know a unique identifier for that NPC so we move the correct one in our code. And so this is just some of the metadata we need to capture when we're defining our event structure. And so to start building out our structure, let's come back to our code. We're going to create a new JSON file. So in our projects folder, let's go under our assets, under data, let's make a new file. We're going to do events.json. So for our JSON file here, we're going to have this be defined as an object. So currently when our player interacts with one of our event zones, we get the ID of that zone. And so we want to be able to quickly look up an event from our object here. And so by structuring as an object, we can now have our key be the ID of the event we're triggering. So now for our event, this is where we need to define those various actions we were talking about. So let's make a new property. We're going to call it events, and we're going to make this an array. And so then in our array, we're going to have those various action objects we were describing. And so now for each of our event objects, we're going to need to know what type it is. So is it adding an NPC to our game? Is it moving an NPC? Is it having the NPC talk to our player? And to keep track of that, we'll add a type field. And now so for our type, we'll just have a string. And as an example, we'll do add NPC. Now when we do one of our actions, one of our events here, we need to provide that metadata so we know how to handle that event. For this, we're just going to add a new field called data, and this will be an object. And now when we parse our data, depending on the type here, we'll expect different fields to be present on this object. As an example for our NPC, we might want things like what direction should our NPC be facing. So we'll add in one of our directions, we'll do down. And so to position our game object, we'll need to know our X and Y value. And so let's add in X. Let's just say we'll do 6, Y, let's do 21. And so this is going to be our player's original starting position. Now for rendering our NPC, we'll need to know which frame to use from our NPC character list. So let's do frame, and we're going to set this equal to 30. And then we'll also want to add in our animation key prefix. That way if our NPC moves around, we'll have them animated properly. And so for our first event, we'll have the mom NPC show up. So let's do NPC, and we'll do _4. All right, so one other field we might want to add could be an ID for the NPC we're adding. So for our event structure, we want to support moving multiple characters around. And so in order to know which character we want to move, we'll need to give them an ID that we can look up in our code and then move that character based on their ID. And so for our existing NPC class, we don't keep track of that. So that's something we'll want to add to that class. So let's add an ID field. And so for this, we can use any number. And I'm just going to do 1001. So for the NPCs we add through our events, we'll start in 1000, and then that way it won't collide with our other NPCs that we've already added to our game. And so one thing to note is this can be any arbitrary ID. We'll just want to make sure that it's unique if we're creating a new NPC instance versus if we're targeting an existing NPC. So now that we have an example of adding an NPC to our game, let's take a look at another example of maybe we want our NPC to talk to our player. So I'm going to copy this object here. Let's paste it. And for this type, instead of add NPC, we could do talk to player. So now when we want a game object to talk to our player, we'll need to know which NPC this is. And so we're going to use that ID field. So now we can say, hey, after we've created this NPC, we want to use that NPC to have a dialogue with our player. So for the rest of our fields, we don't actually need these. Instead, we would want to have an array of messages we want to show to the player. So we'll add in messages. This will be an array. And so this will be an array of strings that we want to pass to our dialogue modal. So for our first string, let's do, I know all kids must leave home one day. We'll do some dots. And next, we'll say, right. We'll do, I must be strong. And now we'll have the mom NPC tell the player the professor's looking for them. We'll say the professor from next door was looking for you. All right, so now that we've added a few events to our JSON file, we have a pretty good idea of what our data structure is going to look like. We're going to pause adding new events, and we're going to work on getting this loaded into our phaser game. Then that way, when our player overlaps with our event zone, we'll be able to grab our event object from our JSON file here. So to do this, we'll need to add it to our preload scene. So first, let's jump over to our assets keys. Let's come down to where we have our data asset keys. Let's add a new one called events. We'll do the same value as our key. Now let's jump over to our preload scene, and let's come up to where we load in our JSON files, and let's copy this line of code here. We'll go ahead and paste it. And so now let's change our asset key. We'll do events, and this will be our assets, data, and it'll be events JSON. So this will take care of loading in our data and putting in our cache. Now we need to update our data utils, so we have a method to grab this from our cache. Let's come down to the bottom of our class, and let's copy our get monster by ID. We'll go ahead and paste that down here. So for our name, let's do get event data. So we'll have our phaser scene, and then we'll expect an event ID of what we want to look up. So we'll paste that in. And now we want to grab this from our events JSON. And so we'll do our data. Instead of doing find, we can just use our event ID to grab it directly from our object. So we'll do data, and then we'll do our event ID. So now that we have a method for grabbing our event data from our cache, let's update our world scene to grab our event data for our zone ID when we have an overlap. So in our handle player movement update method, in our if statement where we check and if we are overlapping, we're logging out our zone name, let's do that lookup from our data. So let's make a new variable, do const, we're going to do events to process. We're going to set that equal to our data utils, and we'll do get event data. And now we want to pass in our phaser scene and our zone.name, which is our ID that we set. Oh, and so our type is expecting a number. Let's jump back to our data utils, and we're going to change this to be a string. We'll save, come back to our world scene. All right, and now let's log out our events to process. All right, so if we save our changes, let's come back to our browser. If we move our player in our event zone, we should now see from our JSON file, we have our events object with the two different event types that we defined. All right, so now that we connected everything together, and when our player overlaps with one of our event zones, we're able to grab our event data from our JSON file. We now want to update our types that are associated with our events. Currently in our data utils, when we call get event data, our type is returning our monster object data type. Instead, we'll want to have a type that's very specific. Instead, we'll want to have a type that represents our data and our events JSON, and then that way it's very clear what action types we support and what the metadata should be for each of those types. So let's jump over to our typedef.js file. Instead of manually typing these out one by one, I'm going to share a link in the description of this video where you'll be able to copy this code. So if you open up that link now, there's going to be this git commit here where we have two different files. We have our events JSON. This will be our final events JSON file we want to use. Then we'll have this typedef.js file here that has the changes that we need to make for our type definition file. All right, what this will show the new code that's been added to our type definition.js file here. So let's copy all of these code lines here. Let's come back to our type definition.js file, and let's go ahead and come to the bottom. We'll paste in our code. Let's save. And while we're here, let's grab our updated events JSON file as well. So we copy our code in our events JSON. We can grab the whole thing. And then we come back to our code. We're just going to replace all of our code in our events JSON file here with our updated code. Alright, so if we save our code changes, before we review what we added, if we come back to our game, if we have our player interact with one of our event zones, we should still see that our event data is being returned. Now for our events array, we now have 6 elements. We also have a new array called requires, but we'll get to that later. So now we've verified our code's working, let's review the code that we just added. So we come into our type definition.js file real quick. So we started off by defining an object that represents our various event types that we'll support. Currently, we have this add NPC and we have our talk to player, and now we have a bunch of new ones as well. So we want to be able to have our NPC move to our player. We want to be able to retrace our NPC's path back to where they started. We want to do things like remove the NPC from our scene once our cutscene's over. And then like for our professor, they're going to be able to give us a monster we can add to our party. And then we have 2 other actions, and this is tied to story flags, and we'll cover this more later once we add that support to our game. We then created type definition blocks that represent our various event action objects from our event data. So for our game event add NPC, this is just going to be an object representing our object that we previously added. So we'll see we have our type field and our data field. So in our type definition, we have type, and now we just hard code this to the only supported event type for this type of definition. All right, then below that, we now define all of the different event objects that represent the object data in our JSON file. So for our game event add NPC, this is representing this object here for when we add our NPC to our game. So for our type, it'll be a string, but specifically it's going to be our add NPC type. For this type of object, there will be no other value. We then have our data object, and so on our data object, we have all our various properties that we added previously. So things like our direction, our X and Y position, frame ID, and our animation key prefix. Versus if we take a look at our NPC that talks to our player, we're going to see that we have our talk to player type, we have our ID for our NPC, and then the messages we want to show. Besides that, we have other objects representing our other types. And so like we have our move to player, we'll need to know which NPC to move, so we have ID. And then we have a definition for when our NPC wants to move back to the original position. So we have an ID, so we know which NPC to move. And then also a direction, so we can update our NPC's direction they face before they start moving. Finally, we have this remove NPC, and so to remove that game object from our scene, we'll need their ID so we can clean up our phaser scene. Besides that, we have objects representing our feature flags. We'll get to those later. All right, then finally, we have this game event, event details, and event data. Event data represents our whole JSON object in our events JSON file. And so we'll have a key that's a string that's our event ID, and that's going to map to one of our event objects. So that's going to represent this event details here. On that object, we'll have 2 properties, events and requires. And so our events is going to be our array of our various events. And then requires, this is going to be an array of strings. And so this is going to be tied to our story flags that we're going to add later. And so we'll come back to that. Finally, for our events, this just matches our game event here. And these are just the various object definitions that we added to our code. All right, so now we reviewed our type definitions. Let's jump over to events.json. And in this file here, this has been updated to represent our 2 cutscenes we're going to show. For our events, we have our add NPC that we previously had. We're then going to move that NPC to where our player is at in our game. We'll then have that mom NPC talk to our player, so this has our messages from before. After she's done talking to our player, we're going to have her appear to go back into our house, and so she'll disappear. And then to do that, we need to remove the NPC from our current scene, and then that way when we transition to our next scene in the building, our NPC will be there. We'll skip add flag for the time being. Next, for a second event, once we're up here, this is going to be tied to where our professor shows up. So we're going to add our NPC. So we have a different animation key prefix and then a different ID in different frames. We're going to move the NPC to our player. We'll have the professor talk to our player. And then our professor is going to give us our starting monster and then leave our scene. And then we'll remove our game object from our scene and we set some more flags. And so for our professor, after he shows up, we're going to have him say, wait right there. Going into the wild grass is dangerous without your own partner. And then please take this iguana knight. And then really this is like the start of our adventure and our player can now go and battle other monsters and other characters. So now that we reviewed the code we copied, if we jump over to our data utils, let's fix our types real quick. So instead of being monster, we're going to do event details. And let's just clean up our code here. So we'll say the event ID to retrieve from the events JSON file. Phaser scene, we'll get rid of this code here. And now down here for our type on our cache data, we want to change this to be our event data. Let's save and just make sure everything's working. If we just go into our scene, if we move our player into our first zone, we're going to see our first event shows up. We have our 6 events. If we move our NPC to our other zone, we should now see our other event data show up. So we're in zone 2, and now we're in an array that has 8 different elements. Alright, with that last change, that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we'll continue working on our cutscene and in-game events feature, and we'll start adding support to our data manager to keep track of which events we've seen in our game, and we'll start updating our world scene to now actually process our event data that we're just currently logging out to our console now. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of this video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please follow the links on your screen now.